the chair of the meeting says, well, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then someone pipes up and says, well, they built the aqueduct. Okay, well, apart from the aqueduct, what have the Romans ever done for us? Clean water and sanitation, and they go through this list of things that the Romans have provided, and you know, the opposition's attitude to our economic management sort of reminds me of that. You know, they stand up here in this place and say, well, what has a Labor government ever done for us? Well, we paid off $1.6 billion of government debt. Okay, well, apart from that, well, an unemployment rate below the national average, long-term unemployment being cut to a quarter of its level in 1996. The fastest growing state economy in Australia, Mr Deputy Speaker. The second most competitive tax regime in Australia. And just last week, they were criticising the Minister for Infrastructure for not attracting federal funds. The same minister who just after 1 year in the job managed to secure $800 million, $800 million, Mr Deputy Speaker, for infrastructure in his portfolio. More money than was ever extracted from the federal government over the last 2 terms of the Howard government, as the Premier has shown. Now, had we not done all this, he didn't forget. No, you just don't understand the process. Had we not done all this work to strengthen and protect the economy, to invest in infrastructure and jobs, we would not be so well positioned. Tasmania would not be so well positioned as we are to deal with the effects of the global financial crisis. Now, this week, Mr Deputy Speaker, this week has also provided the opposition and the Greens a chance to present alternative budgets, as they have done, and to try and demonstrate some economic credibility, but who would have thought they would have squibbed it so badly? After criticising our proposed savings, for months, I welcome the fact that the opposition has now endorsed 99.7% of our own budget. Mr Deputy Speaker, they've copied it. They were so opposed to our savings measures and that they adopted 99.7% of our budget. I mean, how can an opposition? I wrote it myself, Mr Booth. How can an opposition be so bereft of ideas that they have to? And I added it this morning. How can the opposition be so bereft of ideas that they have to copy 99.7% of our budget? Yeah, we'll tinker a bit around the edges. I mean, you know, they don't worry about putting hard work into. They don't worry about putting hard work into constructing a responsible budget. They just copy ours. Had this been a term paper, Mr Deputy Speaker, they would have been accused of plagiarism. They would have been accused of plagiarism.
20 people.
But the opposition still haven't. The opposition still haven't done any significant work to plugging their $4.6 billion black hole.
Yeah, we have, because it doesn't exist.
Now I heard the contribution of Mrs Napier in the adjournment debate last night on this point. Yeah. And I still haven't heard from the opposition what they're going to do to make up for the shortfall in their underfunded Midland Highway, what they're going to do to make up the shortfall in their underfunded Royal Hobart Hospital proposal.
Tote sale.
They've still got a commitment to cutting land tax, although they say it's an aspirational commitment.
We've funded it.
Now that is, I mean, that would be $350 million over the forward estimates if they decided. Well, you said it's an aspirational commitment, so
we're raising the threshold and we've funded that.
So eventually, Eventually, if it's an aspirational commitment, then my assumption is that eventually you're going to cut it completely. Well, if it was cut at this
Your
point,
budget only covers
it
the
would be
next 4 years
$350
as
million
well.
over the forward
What
estimates.
about your aspirational goals? You don't have to fund those.
Now, and let's not forget, okay, it was a 2006 election
Yeah, but
commitment, but let's not forget the flawed future fund proposal. I mean, had the Liberals been elected, they would have cut land tax and payroll tax. They would have invested the future fund in shares.
You're living in the past again, are you?
And that was
We're not.
$1.4 billion for the tax measure, $500 million on the federal future fund. So, had they been elected in 2006, they would have left us with at least a $1.9 billion black hole.
You've left us without a rail operator.
But let's go to the Greens' alternative budget, and the leader of the Tasmanian Greens. It's interesting that he's claimed in
That's
this
pretty
place
insulting.
that his proposal
Point of order,
to
Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think, given that this is the newest member in the House, it would be nice if there was at least one member of the Labor Party who was in here to be able to hear his speech. And I draw your attention to the state of the House.
Corbyn McFine, ring the bells.
They're obviously not interested in what he's got to say. No support whatsoever. Not a single member of the government here to listen.
That's right. I can send him a copy.
Dear, oh dear. Even though we're
You deserve an audience, Daniel.
Even if I don't agree with what you're saying, but...
We Liberals believe in freedom of speech, Daniel.
Start of the house. Start of the house.
About time.
Great job to paste him
Not one member.
We're listening
Not
to
one
him
member.
on the score box and he's doing a fine job. So why don't we just
But you can't stand being here to listen to him.
They were listening on the squawk box. Just said.
I do a bit of dead wood from the back bench.
Quorum present. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Well, he said he was misrepresented. The reason he said he was misrepresented was he offered this measure on the back of a plebiscite. So, what the leader of the Tasmanian Greens then has to explain is what happens to his proposed savings from this measure if the plebiscite fails. Right, that's $94 million. $94 million in his budget is unprovided for. Now, is he going to fund that? Is he going to fund that from debt? I'll get to that in a minute, Mr. Booth. Fund that from debt, or is he going to find other savings? Is he going to cut other areas of the budget? But it also shows a complete misunderstanding of workforce planning that Mr. McKim would propose such a one-size-fits-all approach. A uniform cut across government services. I mean, what's that going to do? What's that going to do to protect frontline services? It's a good thing. It's a good thing that Mr. Deputy Speaker, that Mr. McKim didn't train to become a surgeon, because he would have been going into all his operations with a hacksaw and a mop. But I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that it is hypocritical of Mr. McKim to accuse the government of misrepresenting his position when he continually claims, and as Mr. Booth just did by way of interjection, continually claims that we are going to sack 800 public servants. That is absolutely not true. We are proposing savings equivalent to 800 full-time equivalent positions. And as the Treasurer said, and you can read it on page 12 of the budget speech, if you've bothered to read the budget speech or listen to it at all, on page 12, we expect that we will achieve those savings through targeted voluntary redundancies, vacancy control, early retirement, phased-in retirement, leave without pay, changes in working hours such as moves to part-time work, secondment to the private sector, a review of middle management positions. But we're not going to do it through a blunt instrument that takes a uniform cut in hours and wages all the way across the public service. But 800 full-time equivalent positions is about 3% of the total workforce, and I don't think it will be that difficult to find ways of saving those positions without having any forced redundancies. So it is patently untrue. It's patently untrue. Mr McKim has misled the Parliament. It's patently untrue